The wedding cake sat untouched on the table, its white frosting gleaming under the candlelight like fresh snow, but Sarah Mitchell would never taste it. By midnight, she would be dead poisoned by the one person who should have welcomed her into the family with open arms. This is the true story of how jealousy, obsession, and a mother's twisted love turned the happiest day of a young woman's life into her last. What happened in that Hartford parlor on a cold March evening in 1841 will shock a community, destroy a family, and reveal the darkest corners of the human heart. Stay with me, because the truth of what transpired that night is more chilling than any fiction could ever be. The promise of spring. Sarah Mitchell had never imagined that love could feel like this, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. She stood at the window of her small boarding room on Asylum Street, watching the March wind scatter the last remnants of winter across Hartford's cobblestone streets, and pressed her hand against her heart as if to keep it from bursting through her ribs. In just 3 days she would become Mrs. Jonathan Whitmore, and the thought filled her with such joy that she sometimes had to sit down and simply breathe through the overwhelming happiness. She had met Jonathan 8 months earlier at a church social, where he had asked her to dance with such earnest politeness that she had laughed a genuine, surprised laugh that made him blush to the roots of his sandy hair. He was a clerk at the Hartford Fire Insurance Company, steady and reliable, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that made her feel safe in a way she had never experienced before. Sarah's own parents had died of consumption when she was 16, leaving her to work as a seamstress to support herself. She had spent 5 years sewing other women's wedding dresses, her fingers cramping over delicate lace and silk, always wondering if such happiness would ever be hers. No, impossibly, it was. Jonathan courted her with old-fashioned courtesy, bringing her wildflowers he picked on his walk to work, reading poetry to her in the small garden behind the boarding house, speaking of their future with such certainty that she began to believe in it too. He wanted children, he told her, at least 4, maybe 5. He wanted a house with a garden where she could grow roses. He wanted to grow old with her, to sit on a porch someday and watch their grandchildren play. There was only one shadow over their happiness, and her name was Margaret Whitmore. Jonathan's mother was a widow who had raised her only son alone after her husband died in a factory accident when Jonathan was just 8 years old. She had worked her fingers to the bone as a laundress, taking in washing from Hartford's wealthier families, refusing charity, determined that her boy would have an education and prospects. And she had succeeded. Jonathan was respectable, employed, a young man with a future. But the cost of that success had been Margaret's entire life, and she had no intention of sharing her son with anyone. From the moment Jonathan brought Sarah home to meet his mother, Margaret had made her feelings clear. She never said anything overtly cruel. Her weapons were subtler than that. She would look Sarah up and down with eyes like chips of ice, taking in her worn dress and mended gloves. She would sigh heavily whenever Jonathan mentioned their wedding plans. She would speak of Jonathan's childhood, of the sacrifices she had made, of how no woman could possibly understand the bond between a mother and her only son. She'll come around, Jonathan assured Sarah whenever she expressed her concerns. She's just adjusting to the idea of me being married. Once we're wed, once she sees how happy we are, she'll accept you. You'll see. But Sarah wasn't so sure. She had seen the look in Margaret's eyes when Jonathan announced their engagement, not just disapproval, but something darker, something that made Sarah's skin prickle with instinctive fear. It was the look of someone who had been robbed, someone planning to take back what was theirs. Still, she pushed her worries aside. She was 21 years old and in love, and she refused to let anyone dim the brightness of her joy. She spent her evenings sewing her wedding dress by candlelight, using fabric she had saved for over a year to purchase. It was simple. She couldn't afford anything elaborate, but she embroidered the collar herself with tiny white flowers, each stitch a prayer for happiness. The wedding was to be held at Jonathan's mother's house, a narrow but respectable dwelling on Farmington Avenue. Margaret had insisted on it, saying that it would save money, and that, as the groom's mother, it was her right to host the celebration. Jonathan had agreed before consulting Sarah, and though it made her uneasy, she hadn't protested. She wanted to start their marriage on good terms with his mother. She wanted to believe that love could conquer suspicion, that kindness could melt even the coldest heart. On the morning of the wedding day, Sarah woke before dawn. She couldn't sleep, her mind racing with excitement and nervous anticipation. She rose and dressed carefully, putting on her wedding gown and arranging her dark hair in the style she had practiced. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand, and barely recognized the radiant woman staring back at her. She looked happy. She looked loved. She looked like a bride. Her landlady, Mrs. Chen, a kind Chinese woman who had immigrated to Hartford 5 years earlier, knocked softly on her door. "You look beautiful, Miss Sarah," she said, her English careful and precise, like spring flower. "But I must tell you something before you go." Sarah turned, surprised by the serious tone in Mrs. Chen's voice. "What is it?" Mrs. Chen hesitated, her weathered hands twisting together. "Yesterday I see woman outside, watching house, watching your window. She look at you with," she struggled for the words, "with hate. Very strong hate. I see this look before in old country. It is dangerous look." "What did she look like?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Tall woman. Thin. Dress all black. Gray hair. Margaret Whitmore." Sarah felt a chill run through her, but she forced herself to smile. "It's just my future mother-in-law. She's having difficulty adjusting to Jonathan getting married. But I'm sure once the wedding is over, everything will be fine." Mrs. Chen didn't look convinced, but she nodded slowly. "I hope so. But you be careful, Miss Sarah. That look, it is not just sadness or anger. It is hate that wants to destroy. I know this look." Sarah thanked her and tried to push the warning from her mind. She gathered her few belongings. She would move into Jonathan's rented room after the wedding and made her way through Hartford streets to Farmington Avenue. It was a beautiful March day, cold but bright, with a sharp blue sky and sunlight that made the remaining snow sparkle like diamonds. She took it as a good sign, a blessing on their union. When she arrived at Margaret's house, Jonathan was waiting at the door. His face lit up when he saw her, and he took her hands in his, squeezing them tightly. "You look like an angel," he whispered. "I'm the luckiest man in Hartford and the whole world." Inside, the house had been prepared for the wedding. Margaret had actually made an effort. The small parlor was clean and neat, with fresh candles in the holders and the furniture polished to a shine. A minister from their church stood ready to perform the ceremony, and a few Jonathan's friends from the insurance company had been invited as witnesses. There was even a wedding cake on the sideboard, a beautiful confection. That must have cost Margaret dearly. Sarah felt a surge of hope. Perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps Margaret was making peace with the marriage, showing her acceptance through this effort and expense. Margaret herself appeared from the kitchen, wearing a black dress. She always wore black. Still in mourning for her husband after 15 years, but she had pinned a small white ribbon to her collar. She approached Sarah with something that almost resembled a smile. "Sarah," she said, and her voice was almost warm. "Welcome. I know we've had our difficulties, but I've been thinking, you're going to be my daughter now, and I should treat you as such. I want us to start fresh, from this day forward. Will you allow me that?" Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. This was what she had hoped for, what she had prayed for. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore, I would like nothing more." Margaret nodded. "Then let's begin this new chapter of our lives. Jonathan, take your place. Sarah, are you ready?" The ceremony was simple but moving. Sarah barely heard the minister's words, focused entirely on Jonathan's face, on the love and promise she saw there. When he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, her hands were shaking. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Jonathan kissed her gently, she felt as if her heart might actually stop from happiness. The small gathering applauded, and Margaret brought out glasses of wine for a toast. She poured carefully, her hands steady, and distributed the glasses. She even poured a special glass for Sarah, filling it more generously than the others. "To my son and his bride," Margaret said, raising her glass. "May they have all the happiness they deserve." Everyone drank, and Sarah took a long sip of the wine, grateful for something to calm her racing heart. It tasted slightly bitter, but wine often did. She smiled at Margaret over the rim of her glass, hoping this really was a new beginning. Then came the cake. Margaret insisted on cutting it herself and serving each guest personally. She handed Sarah a particularly large piece, urging her to eat. "You must be hungry," she said. "And this is your wedding cake. You should enjoy every bite." Sarah took a forkful, and the cake was delicious, moist and sweet, with a hint of almond in the frosting. She ate half the slice while chatting with Jonathan's friends, accepting their congratulations, feeling like she was floating several inches above the floor. This was her wedding day. She was married. She was loved. Everything was going to be wonderful, but 20 minutes later, as the small party was winding down, Sarah felt the first cramp. It was sharp and sudden, doubling her over for a moment before receding. She straightened, confused, pressing her hand to her stomach. Perhaps she had eaten too quickly, nervous as she was. Then came another cramp, worse than the first. And another. Jonathan noticed immediately, his face flooding with concern. "Sarah, what's wrong?" "I don't know," she gasped. "My stomach. It hurts terribly." Within minutes, the pain had become unbearable. Sarah collapsed into a chair, her face wet, sweat breaking out on her forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. Her vision was blurring at the edges, and she felt violently nauseous. "Get a doctor," Jonathan shouted. "Someone get Dr. Morrison, quickly." One of his friends ran from the house while Jonathan knelt beside Sarah, holding her hand, his face stricken with fear. "Hold on, my love, the doctor is coming, just hold on." But Sarah could barely hear him. The pain was consuming her, burning through her belly and radiating outward. She looked up and saw Margaret standing by the sideboard, watching with an expression that sent ice through Sarah's veins. It wasn't concern, it wasn't shock, it was satisfaction, and in that moment, Sarah understood. The bitter wine, the generous slice of cake, the sudden acceptance and warmth. It had all been a lie, a trap, a final act of possession. "Jonathan," she whispered, but she could barely form the words. "Your mother." Then the convulsions began, and everything descended into nightmare. The unraveling. Dr. Benjamin Morrison arrived within 15 minutes, his medical bag in hand, his face grave. He had delivered babies and set broken bones, treated fever and pneumonia. But when he examined Sarah Sarah Whitmore. Now his experienced hands could feel the truth of what was happening, and his heart sank. "How long has she been like this?" he demanded, checking her pulse, which was racing and erratic. "Less than half an hour," Jonathan said, his voice breaking. "We were celebrating. She ate some cake, drank some wine, and then suddenly he couldn't finish the sentence." Dr. Morrison looked at the young bride convulsing on the chair, her wedding dress already soiled, her face contorted in agony. He had seen poisoning before, arsenic usually, sometimes mercury or lead. The symptoms were unmistakable: severe gastrointestinal distress, muscle spasms, rapid pulse, confusion, and if his suspicions were correct, there was very little he could do. "We need to induce vomiting," he said sharply. "Get me warm salt water, immediately. And someone needs to fetch the constable. Now." "The constable?" Jonathan stared at him in confusion. "Why? Sarah is ill. She needs—" "Your wife has been poisoned, Mr. Whitmore," Dr. Morrison said bluntly, "and unless we can purge the toxin from her system quickly, she will die. So get me that salt water and get the constable here. This is a matter for the law." The room erupted in chaos. Jonathan's friends scattered to follow the doctor's orders, while Jonathan himself stood frozen, unable to process what he had just heard. Poisoned? How could Sarah be poisoned? They were at his mother's house, surrounded by friends and family, celebrating their marriage. Margaret Whitmore stood perfectly still by the sideboard, her face expressionless. When Dr. Morrison turned to look at her, she met his gaze without flinching. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said slowly, "did you prepare the food and drink for this gathering?" "I did," she said calmly. "I baked the cake yesterday. I poured the wine myself. And did anyone else eat or drink what the bride consumed?" Margaret's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "The cake, yes, we all had cake. But the wine, I poured Sarah a special glass. From a different bottle, a finer vintage, to honor her as the bride." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Jonathan, in his shocked state, understood the implication. He turned to his mother, his face draining of all color. "Mother," his voice was barely a whisper. "What did you do?" "What I had to do," Margaret said, and there was no remorse in her tone, only a strange, cold certainty. "She would have taken you from me. You're all I have, Jonathan. Everything I've done, every sacrifice I've made, has been for you. I gave you life. I raised you alone. I worked my fingers bloody to give you a future. And she thought she could just walk in and take it all, take you from me. You poisoned her." Jonathan's voice was rising, cracking with horror and disbelief. "You poisoned my wife? On our wedding day? She was never going to be your wife. Not truly." Margaret's face was calm, almost serene. "You belong to me. You always have. I carried you in my body, Jonathan. My blood fed you, my milk nursed you. No woman can ever have that claim on you. No woman can ever love you the way I do. Dr. Morrison had seen many terrible things in his years of medical practice, but the calm madness in Margaret Whitmore's eyes chilled him to his bones. He had heard of cases like this, mothers so obsessed with their children that they would kill to keep them, but he had never witnessed it himself. One of Jonathan's friends arrived with the salt water, and Dr. Morrison tried to get Sarah to drink it, tried to induce vomiting to expel whatever poison was destroying her from the inside, but it was too late. Sarah's body was shutting down, her organs failing one by one. She convulsed violently one last time, her eyes meeting Jonathan's, and in them he saw not accusation but sorrow. For the life they would never have, the children who would never be born, the happiness that had been stolen from them. "I love you," she whispered with her last breath. "I'm sorry." And then she was gone. Sarah Whitmore died in her wedding dress, in a stranger's parlor, less than 2 hours after speaking her vows. She was 21 years old. The constable arrived to find Jonathan on his knees holding his wife's body, sobbing with such anguish that it brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. Everyone except Margaret, who stood watching her son with an expression of grim satisfaction. "She's gone now," Margaret said softly. "It's just us again, Jonathan. The way it should be. The way it always should have been." Jonathan looked up at his mother, and in his eyes was something that made even the hardened constable take a step back. It was hatred, pure and absolute, mixed with a grief so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. "You killed her," he said, his voice hollow. "You killed the only person I ever loved. You murdered my wife." "I saved you," Margaret corrected. "From a fortune hunter who saw you as a meal ticket, from a woman who could never love you the way I do. I did this for you, Jonathan. Out of love." "Love?" Jonathan's voice broke into a scream. "You call this love? You're a monster. You're insane." The constable, whose name was Thomas Walsh, had heard enough. "Margaret Whitmore, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Sarah Whitmore. You'll be taken to the Hartford jail and held there until your trial." Margaret didn't resist as he took her arms and bound them. She looked at Jonathan one last time, and there was almost pity in her expression. "You'll understand someday," she said. "When the grief passes, you'll understand that I did this for us, that I had no choice." "I will never understand," Jonathan said, his voice shaking. "And I will never forgive you. I hope you hang for this. I hope you suffer the way Sarah suffered. I hope you die knowing that you destroyed the only thing that mattered to me." Margaret was led away, still calm, still certain of her righteousness. The constable would later testify that she showed no remorse, no recognition that she had done anything wrong. In her mind, she had simply removed an obstacle, protected what was hers. Dr. Morrison examined the remaining wine in Sarah's glass and the cake. He found arsenic in both, enough to kill a horse, let alone a young woman. Margaret had been planning this for weeks, perhaps months. She had obtained the poison from rat powder, carefully extracted and concentrated it, and then methodically mixed it into the wine and the frosting of the cake. The wine would act quickly, the cake would ensure the dose was lethal. She had left nothing to chance. The trial, when it came 3 months later, was a sensation. Hartford had never seen anything like it. A mother who murdered her son's bride out of jealous obsession. The courtroom was packed every day, with people standing in the aisle and crowding at the windows to catch a glimpse of the one who had become known as the Demon Mother. Margaret showed no emotion throughout the proceedings. She admitted freely to what she had done, though she refused to call it murder. "I protected my son," she told the court. "That is not a crime. That is a mother's sacred duty." The prosecution brought forth witness after witness, neighbors who testified to Margaret's strange possessiveness over Jonathan, her threats when he announced his engagement, her obsessive behavior. Mrs. Chen, Sarah's landlady, testified about seeing Margaret watching Sarah's window in the days before the wedding, and the look of hatred she had observed. Dr. Morrison presented the medical evidence, the arsenic, the calculated cruelty of poisoning a bride at her own wedding. Jonathan testified last, and his testimony was devastating. He spoke of his mother's increasing instability after he met Sarah, her demand that he end the engagement, her threats of what she might do if he married. He had dismissed it as empty words, the fears of a lonely widow. He had never imagined she would actually do something so monstrous. When asked if he wanted mercy for his mother, Jonathan looked at her directly and said, "She deserves none. She took the most precious thing in my life and destroyed it out of selfishness and madness. She turned my wedding day into a funeral." She made me a widower before I was barely a husband. If there is justice in this world, she will pay with her life." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Margaret Whitmore was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by hanging. She was executed on September 15, 1841, in the yard of the Hartford jail. Even at the gallows, she showed no remorse. Her last words were, "I did what any mother would do. I protected my child. God will understand, even if man does not." The trapdoor opened, and Margaret Whitmore fell to her death. But the damage she had done lived on. Jonathan never recovered from Sarah's death. He left Hartford immediately after his mother's execution, unable to bear the memories that haunted every street, every building. Some said he moved west, to the frontier territories where a man could disappear and start over. Others claimed he died of a broken heart within a year. The truth was never known. He simply vanished from the records, a ghost haunted by ghosts. Sarah was buried in Hartford's Old North Cemetery, in a plot purchased by the seamstresses she had worked with. Her gravestone read, Sarah Mitchell Whitmore, born 1802, died 1841. A bride for 2 hours, beloved forever. For years afterward, young women would leave flowers on her grave before their own weddings, as if seeking her blessing or protection from the same twisted fate. The house on Farmington Avenue where the tragedy occurred was never lived in again. It stood empty for decades, windows dark, a monument to the terrible thing that had happened within its walls. People said it was haunted, that on March evenings, you could see a young woman in a white dress standing at the window, waiting for a happiness that would never come. Eventually, the house was torn down, but the story lived on. The case of Margaret Whitmore became a cautionary tale discussed in medical journals as an example of dangerous maternal obsession, debated in legal circles as a question of sanity and culpability. But beyond the academic discussions and the legal precedents, it remained a human tragedy, a story of love destroyed by possessive madness, of a young woman's life cut short by the very person who should have protected her. In the end, Margaret Whitmore's love for her son was so consuming that it became indistinguishable from hatred for anyone who might take him from her, hatred for his independence, hatred for his happiness if it didn't include her. She loved him so much that she was willing to destroy him to keep him, to make him suffer for the rest of his life rather than allow him to be happy with someone else. It was not love at all. It was ownership, possession, a sickness of the soul that could only end in destruction. Sarah's story reminds us that love, real love, is generous and selfless. It wants happiness for the beloved, even if that happiness doesn't include us. It celebrates their joy, supports their choices, and wishes them well. Love that seeks to control, to possess, to destroy rather than release, that is not love. That is something far darker. On quiet March evenings in Hartford, when the wind carries the promise of spring, people sometimes speak of the tragic bride, the girl who died in her wedding dress at the hands of her mother-in-law. They tell the story to their daughters, a warning about the danger of obsession disguised as devotion. They tell it to their sons, a reminder that sometimes the greatest threat comes from the people who claim to love us most. And somewhere, in whatever realm the dead inhabit, perhaps Sarah Mitchell Whitmore rests in peace, finally free from the poison that ended her life but could never touch the purity of the love she shared, however briefly, with the man who mourned her until his dying day. The wedding cake sat untouched on the table for 3 days before someone finally threw it away. But the story of what it contained and what it destroyed has never been forgotten. The tragedy of Sarah Whitmore teaches us that love must never become imprisonment. True love, whether parental, romantic, or otherwise, respects boundaries, celebrates independence, and finds joy in the happiness of others. When love becomes obsession, when affection transforms into possession, it ceases to be love at all and becomes a force of destruction. We honor Sarah's memory by recognizing the warning signs of possessive, controlling behavior, by understanding that anyone who claims to love, while trying to isolate us, control our choices, or harm those we care about, is not acting out of love but out of something far more dangerous. And we honor her by choosing, every day, to love freely and generously, releasing our grip on those we cherish and trusting them to make their own choice, live their own lives, and find their own happiness. Sarah's life was brief, but the lesson her death teaches us is eternal. Let love be love. Let it be free. Let it be kind. Anything else is poison.